Thanks again for inviting me on. I watched a couple of you guys' previous presentations. Milo, your botany expert and mentor, and I think there was an engineer who is working in marine biology. That was all really cool. I feel very grateful to have been invited on this. I want to say right up front, I'm not an actual scientist. I don't have degrees in science like some of your viewers have. I would more consider myself in a group of like citizen scientists. And I think in the modern world, especially with apps, I want to make sure I mention it right up front because I may forget to mention it later, is there are a lot of people who don't have formal training who do help scientists all the time. You know, I talk to herpetologists, and there are people who are just like enthusiasts about reptiles. And they'll go out and catch snakes and lizards and stuff and document them, take pictures, upload them to iNaturalist. And they're really helping scientists out because it's like expanding the amount of data that scientists can collect in the field. There's only so many of them. And so that's how I see my role, is introducing people to a field, like in this case, you know, the fungal kingdom and mushrooms, and also encouraging people to use iNaturalist and put things online in those science databases, because that overall helps scientists and helps science. So that's kind of the context there. So I'm an amateur, I'm not an expert, but I do have a good level of interest and excitement about these things, and I pride myself on having sort of a childlike curiosity. I saw a lot of that with your scientist speakers, and I can definitely relate to that. I think you don't have to be a formally trained scientist to maintain this sort of curiosity about the natural world, and to pursue it and, you know, read on your own. And if you are pursuing a degree in it, that's great. If you're not, there are still things you can do. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. So I was born in northern Italy. I'm mixed family. My mom's American, my dad's Italian. She was over there teaching Italian. And so I started my life just below the Alps in northern Italy. So Bergamo is the name of my hometown. I lived in a suburb of it. It was actually really badly hit with COVID, so it was in the news recently, which was really sad, but they're doing better now, like a lot of places. And that's kind of where I spent my first 11 years. And then my mom wanted to move back to Northern California. So Cotati, for you guys that are familiar, you know, it's in between Petaluma and Santa Rosa, but I went to the Cotati Runner Park School District. So I graduated from Branch Cotati High School. And you know, I remember it was a rough move, kind of being in middle school and moving to a whole other country. I already spoke English, but just like, I was in an ESL class just because I had an accent and kind of like certain words weren't as easy to figure out. And so I can definitely empathize with, and I was in class with a lot of ESL kids, most of them Spanish speaking. Spanish is really close to Italian. So between that and restaurant work, I've picked up a lot of at least colloquial Spanish, which is nice. But I definitely learned that feeling right away of feeling kind of like an outsider and having a hard time fitting in, which I think is common in that middle school, beginning high school years. It was just a little extra if you're essentially an immigrant, even though I was a citizen. So I didn't really get my act together as a student until I decided that I wanted to fly. I wanted to be a pilot at the time. This is like, you know, freshman year, 9th grade. And so I started to look into getting into the Naval Academy, which is the Navy and Marine Corps military academy, where you would go get a 4-year degree. All the degrees at the Naval Academy are engineering based, but you can do music and history and other things as a minor. And then you would go into the military as a commissioned officer, go into a flight program. You owe them, so the school is free, but you owe them like at least 8 years of your life, I think. That's kind of the plan with military academies. Started to look at the requirements, and I'm already starting my 10th grade year here. And, you know, it's like at least 2 extracurricular activities, at least 2 sports, you know, AP courses, you know, high GPA, et cetera, et cetera. And it was a pretty daunting list. So I said, okay, I've really been slacking off my first year in high school. If I don't get my stuff together, I'm not even going to be eligible for this school. So I really, you know, I started wrestling, swimming. I joined, you know, like the associate student body and drama club, and started to do more extracurricular activities. Got my grades up, got into AP courses. And in the end, got a congressional nomination for the Naval Academy. So I started to work on those things. I didn't get into the Naval Academy in the end, but I did get into UC Davis. So I got into a good 4-year, which at the time kind of seemed to be the push and seemed to be the direction. You know, after high school, we got to go to a 4-year university. So I went to UC Davis for a year. and still it felt like it was too early for me and I was too young to be disciplined to really do the coursework and feel excited about it. GE stuff was really not interesting me, but I had done ROTC. At the time it was run through Berkeley. So Berkeley did ROTC for a bunch of different universities. That's where the main Navy slash, you'll hear Navy Marine Corps a lot. Marine Corps is like the sister service. So they're part of the Department of the Navy. So Marines have some of their own training school, especially for infantry related stuff, but a lot of their training school, like aviation, is a joint school. So it's sailors and Marines together. So I met my first Marines doing ROTC at Berkeley, and I was really impressed. They seemed like really efficient, really excited about what they were doing, and just dedicated to their craft, be them artillery officers or going into other things. And so to me, the Marine Corps felt like the most difficult service and kind of the most challenging. They had the most pride. So I joined the Marine Corps. I went enlisted with the idea that there are aviation programs that you can do. You can continue your schooling further, get into flight training. You know, there are other ways to go about becoming a pilot in the military. Starting in the enlisted ranks is something you can do. So I go to boot camp, go to combat training, do all that stuff. And by the way, I have to give a shout out to my dad here because he went into the recruiting office with me at the time when I was 19. And I was like really good shape from swimming all the time, wrestling. And so I was like, oh yeah, I want to do something cool, like special forces, like fast team infantry, blah, blah, blah. And my dad kind of gave me a tap in the back of the head and he said, do something smart that you can get a job with later. Like the infantry's cool if you make it, but also there's not a lot of jobs. Maybe you can be a cop. But there were times in the 90s where police departments actually weren't hiring Marine Corps infantry specifically because of their reputation. So anyways, thanks to my dad, and lucky for me, I've always been okay at taking advice. I took my dad's advice. So I went into an aviation program. I thought I was joining up to be aircrew, which is actually flying around on helicopters, either manning a machine gun or doing loading. You could have been on a C-130, that kind of thing. Basically being part of the crew on an aircraft. Unbeknownst to me, I'd already been slated for air traffic control way from the beginning. But of course, recruiters, even when they don't lie to you up front, they always have to lie a little bit because they're just trying to pump their numbers. So I go through boot camp, come home for recruiting duty, go to combat training, do some guard duty. By the time I graduate from combat training, that's where they're kind of like in the movies, they're reading off lists like, you know, Adams, 0311 infantry, you know, Ferlito, 7251 air traffic control. And I was like, what? I'm like, I raised my hand. I'm like, I'm supposed to be on the plane? I don't know what air traffic control is. And he's like, yep, you know, that's tough. That's what the thing says. So I got sent to where everybody else goes for aviation now, which is Pensacola, Florida, home of the Blue Angels. It's kind of cool just walking around base. All of a sudden you might see like 5 inverted F-18s in tight formation just flying over you because they're practicing. So they don't announce that. So you just like see the Blue Angels all over the place. And that's where pilots, controllers, aircrew in the Navy Marine Corps all train. All the schools are there. So showed up, had no idea what I was getting into. I'd never heard about air traffic control, but I guess, you know, they need some of the higher, specifically GT score has to do with like visualizing mechanics and stuff. When you take your ASVAB in high school, that's the placement test for the military, and it's broken down into a bunch of different scores. And certain jobs you have to have a minimum score of whatever. Recruiters don't like to waste that score because if you go into the infantry with that score, like the qualifications for the infantry are much lower. So kind of anybody can do it for the most part. Anyways, so that's how I got thrown into air traffic control without knowing it. Start the school, we started learning about weather and aviation, all kinds of stuff. And by the time I was done with that 4-month school, I really loved what we were doing. I didn't do anything real yet, but went into a simulator and did, you know, simulator is just a bunch of TV screens that simulates a control tower. And so you have the different positions and then instructors will rate you on how you perform, et cetera. Going out of there, I then went into the fleet, meaning I actually got assigned to a duty station, and I was lucky I got sent to Camp Pendleton where I already had a couple of friends. It's in Southern California. And that's a tower, it's a military airport that mostly does helicopters. So UH-1 Hueys, they're kind of the medium-sized rounded helicopters you see in like Vietnam movies. They're still flying around in upgraded avionics. And Cobras or H-1s are kind of the skinny attack helicopters that the Marine Corps has, as well as CH-46s, which are the dual rotor kind of banana-shaped long troop transports. So those are the main aircraft that were stationed at Camp Pendleton. So I mostly worked with helicopters during this time, which is interesting. Helicopters still have momentum and still fly a lot like airplanes. It's not quite like in the movies where you think a helicopter can just come to an abrupt stop, and so why do you even need it? That's definitely not how it works, and it's challenging, but they are slower than fixed-wing aircraft and are more maneuverable. So that gives you a chance to kind of, it was a great place to learn the ropes, essentially. And then from there, I did eventually deploy to Iraq. I did 7 months out there. Same thing. I worked radar mostly instead of tower. Camp Pendleton has both. Out in Iraq, I was working radar. That was a really interesting experience. Again, supporting aircraft that were out on mission. So we worked all kinds of fixed wing helicopters, British planes, US planes. Some of them came back shot up. Some of them were on, on fire. One was struck by lightning, and that was really interesting. We were doing a precision approach where you're looking at a specific scope and you're actually talking the pilot down to the runway. And this flight of two, I think A-10s, had lost their comm system because his number two, she got struck by lightning. So she lost all her communications except for the aircraft to aircraft communication. So what happened is number one, flight lead landed. We brought him into this storm, because the visibility was bad. And then we were able to talk to him and he would relay the instructions to her. So we were able to talk her down to the runway going through the co-pilot's radio. So, a couple of little stories there about Iraq sort of being a different and interesting experience. I didn't experience a lot of personal danger myself. That base is 30,000 people. I didn't go outside the wire. We had a few mortar and missile hits here and there, and those are scary enough. But so that was a really interesting experience. Came back, kind of finished my certifications, and then the FAA I knew was hiring. They've been hiring for a long time. So when I got out of the military in 2008, I started to apply with air traffic control agencies, a couple private, and then mostly the FAA. And eventually I got hired, and I was really lucky. I waited for SFO and I was able to get directly into SFO, which was good on the one hand because it's a great place. It's the best place to work, really, highest pay, et cetera, around here, where obviously my friends and family are. Also kind of a rough transition to go from military helicopters straight into like super busy air carrier traffic. Totally different ball game. And while I knew how to work a radio, I still had a lot to learn about how aviation works and how air traffic works. So I've been there about 11 years. It's a great job. I get to train people all the time on the job. You do a little bit of classroom schoolwork, but most of it you have to do on the radio, on the job. So that's kind of a brief summary of my career. And then, in terms of other things that I got into in the last 5-6 years, just sort of started getting into rock climbing and mountaineering, and just being outdoors more, learning more about fishing and hunting. And mushrooms just started to pop up. Milo, and a funny story, Milo and I are friends because we actually met, out in the field. Like I was rock climbing with some friends and he was just there fishing and kind of doing some climbing on his own. And we started up a conversation, and eventually like a month later we went camping together, and we've been friends ever since. So we've been in the Eastern Sierras and we climbed Mount Shasta together. Got lots of cool pictures and lots of good times together. So I have to really thank Milo for introducing me to a lot of the things that I'm now very into, including mushrooms. Milo was my first sort of mushroom foraging mentor. So a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about today, I was initially taught by Milo, and then I started reading on my own and going out with other people. There's an expert on my block actually, who's an old guy who's been in the San Francisco Mycological Society for years. So it's always fun to bring him mushrooms and be like, oh, what do you think about this? And like, do you know how to cook that? And I've been to, Ecuador and Peru doing mountaineering. I still need to get over to Europe, but my coworker Fred and I, we climbed Mount Chimborazo a couple of years ago in Ecuador, which is it's technically the highest point on Earth. So when you ask what's the tallest place on Earth or what's the highest mountain on Earth, there are 3 answers that are all correct depending on how you look at it. Mount Everest is the highest elevation in the world, 29,030 feet, something like that. I think Maui, but one of the Hawaiian islands, if you measure it starting underwater where the rise actually starts, it is the tallest mountain in the world. It's just that half of it's underwater. And then Chimborazo, because the Earth kind of sticks out at the equator, the crust pokes out into space a little bit more, and it's really close to the equator. Even though the altitude is 22 or 23,000, so a good 6,000 feet in sea level lower than Everest, It's actually the highest point out in space that you can be on, or measured from the center of the Earth. If you put the two mountains together, Chimborazo would stick up further into space. And so we got to hike that mountain and do sunrise there at the top of the world, essentially, which was a really cool feeling. I'll probably never do Everest because it's so busy and so expensive, but Chimborazo is a great alternative for people, and South America's great. It's a really good experience. So yeah, that kind of sums up how I got into things. And mushrooms are a lot easier than mountaineering, simply because you can usually access them from your front yard to the park, the regional parks behind me. I have Redwood Regional and all those East Bay parks. And I know, there's lots of foraging in Santa Rosa and places you can go. So yeah, especially this time of year, this is a great time, because now that the rains are coming is when mushrooms start to pop up all over the place. Okay, cool. So we already did introductions. Yeah, I've been foraging for 5-6 years or so seasonally. Most of it you're going to do during the winter and the spring. Again, I'm self-trained, kind of started out with Milo, have now been out with other people, and I also take people out and go over mushrooms. I'll go through this quickly just for the time, but I wanted to give you guys a chance to throw down kind of what you already know or think about mushrooms. There's a lot of rumors and misconceptions out there, so we probably won't have time for all you guys to type everything in. So I'll just go, I covered some of the more common misconceptions or things. So mushrooms are poisonous or dangerous. So let me backtrack for just a second. The purpose of this class is to give you an overview on all the mushrooms kind of that are around you here in California, what purpose they serve, and how to go about introducing yourself to this world. Not all mushrooms are toxic. In fact, the majority of them are not. However, I'll put a disclaimer on this right on the front. You should not do this course and then go out and just start randomly eating mushrooms. That is very dangerous. There are a couple of really, really toxic, deadly mushrooms that grow all over California that I will cover. And they can be really similar. A lot of the poisonings that happen are from immigrant families from like China and Thailand, who are used to picking an edible mushroom in Asia that looks a lot like the death cap, for example. And so they just assume it's the same thing, which is very dangerous. You should never assume anything about mushrooms, especially when you don't know them. So just want to give out that caveat. You should always be with an experienced person when foraging mushrooms. You should only eat something once it's been identified, not just by you, but by someone else, and you have multiple points of identification. I'll go over that in a little more detail later, but I just wanted to give out a warning that this can be a dangerous activity when undertaken carelessly, but it can be perfectly safe and educational as long as you follow certain guidelines. So back to our misconceptions. Mushrooms are poisonous or dangerous. Handling them is not safe. They can be slimy or gross, and they are psychedelic, which involves a toxin or a poison. So I'm not going to answer all of these here, but the class will cover some of these. So here are kind of the basics of the mushroom. Mushroom it's neither plant or animal, it's a type of fungus, and it's from the kingdom fungi or fungi, which includes molds, yeast, and other things that I'm not going to cover in this course. What you commonly refer to as a mushroom is the fruiting body or sexual organ. It's how it reproduces that you see sticking up, usually above the ground. Sometimes they're buried, like truffles, which are a fungus. Again, sometimes they're growing under trees, in trees, etc. And you can see the basic structure here of how mushrooms start. Spores, you can think of spores as seeds. They're more simple structures than that and not the same exact thing. But essentially, this is how the mushroom propagates. The millions and millions of spores will blow out through the wind, usually coming down from the gills in a kind of classical mushroom. And then when they hit the right amount of moisture in the ground, they'll start to propagate, form hyphae. Those hyphae will join together and form mycelium. And what you'll get is this crazy looking white spider web underground, which I have photos of later, and you can see. And normally it's trying to stay away from like sunlight and oxygen and air. And so it'll stay underground until it finds the right conditions, right time of year, temperature, moisture, all these things are pretty important. And then that's when mushrooms will pop up. So when you are finding and picking a mushroom, it's similar to picking an apple off a tree in the sense that you're not hurting the original organism. The only thing you're doing if you get to a place where there's tons of mushrooms and you take all the mushrooms is you're just not leaving some for someone else, but you're not really damaging the organism or the environment, as long as you're being careful about how you take them up. So certainly going in places you're not supposed to go, off trail where there's signs, trampling things, ripping things out and kind of not sort of replacing the soil there, like that's bad and you shouldn't do that. But in terms of damage to the organism, you're not doing anything bad to the organism by cutting out or pulling out the mushroom. And as you transport it, the spores, it's good to transport it in a basket or a mesh or something that's breathable, because as you carry them, they will continue to spread their spores. So you're actually helping the organism spread throughout the forest when you do that. Here is an example of a bunch of different types of fungus. I took most of these pictures and picked most of these mushrooms myself. So you have top left, you have gills, tube mushrooms. That's where you can see the cross section. Boletes like the porcino are famous for this. Instead of actual gills, there's all these little tubules and the spores fall out of there. You have shelf mushrooms, often growing on tree in little shelves, they look like, mostly horizontally. Tooth like the hedgehog, that's in the top right. You have cups, which are really interesting and varied. Corals, which often look like they belong underneath the sea, honestly. Most are edible. There's a few that are toxic, not really badly, but they won't be fun to eat. You have saddles, jelly there in the middle, and stomach, which means they're kind of shaped round and have content on the inside. So especially as they dry out, if you kind of squeeze those mushrooms, usually there's a hole in the top and they'll puff out a bunch of spores. And there's tons of cool videos online in slow motion where you can see that. So like I promised, here's a little bit more on mycelium. Minimize the camera here. So this is what you normally see underground. In these pictures, what someone did is probably turn over a leaf or pick up a log. And then the same way you would find a salamander oftentimes is where you're going to find mycelium. So you can see these feathery kind of spiderwebby structures. And these are really important. It's the main body of the fungus, and it's how it propagates, and also part of how it decomposes matter. Mushrooms don't photosynthesize like plants do. They don't have chlorophyll, so they can't take CO2 and make oxygen, and they can't produce sugar. That's one of the main differences between mushrooms and plants, aside from their cell structure. So they're neither consumers nor producers. They kind of take the role of bacteria. I think animal scavengers, bacteria, and fungus all provide, in different ways, provide the decomposition that happens in the forest, but everywhere else. And as you can see from that quote, if there were no device for decay, there would soon be no need for one. What that means is that we take for granted that dead tree life and plant life and everything that we're walking on in the substrate in the forest is just kind of, it's going to rot and decompose. But that doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? If you control for temperature and sterilize something and keep it in a vacuum and put a dead leaf in there, it's not going to decompose. You need bacteria and fungus and sometimes scavengers for those things to decompose. If they didn't exist, we would be buried in dead matter, essentially, and we'd have to continue building on top of that. So this is just part of the natural process and how nature kind of cleans up after itself. Couple of subdivisions here in mushrooms. So you have saprotrophic. These are mushrooms that feed on dead biomaterial. So you'll see them on cow patties, sometimes on dead animals. You'll see fungus growing over them or out of them. Mold is something that does this, wood, leaves, etc. And then you have biotrophic fungus, which is parasitic. So they're either growing out of wood or they feed on other mushrooms or insects, but they can go after live insects. There's a famous one in South America that does that. So those are kind of the two different things that fungus eats generally. Here's one of the things that's also happening underground with mycelium. So ectomycorrhiza, this comes from the Greek. Ecto is outside, myco is fungus or mushroom, and rhiza is roots. So I think there's an endomycorrhizal process as well, but I'll just describe this one. What's happening here is about 10% of plant species participate in this. And what's happening is the filaments of mycelium, which are, you can kind of think of them as the root system of fungus, are mixing in with the root systems of live plants. There are a few parasitic examples of this that are bad for the plant and will kill it, but the vast majority of these interactions are mutually beneficial for the plant and for the mushroom. And this is something that well-seasoned gardeners know. In fact, sometimes they'll implant spores or inoculate spores in their wood chips of mushrooms that are specifically beneficial for plants. And what's happening here is the mushroom is giving the, especially juvenile plants, certain nutrients it's not able to produce on its own. And in exchange, the mushroom is taking certain nutrients from the plants. So what you have is the mushrooms are mostly taking sugars from the plants that are produced through photosynthesis, which again, the mushrooms cannot do that. And in return, they're giving the plants water, nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, which you'll recognize as some of the ingredients in any fertilizer that you go out and buy. So this is a natural way of helping fertilize plants. There's a lot of secondary things that happen as well. Mycelium tends to extend root systems. So this chemical communication that similar species of plants can do with each other in terms of warning each other about danger and things like that, it's extending that network further than it normally could. Also, any of the structural integrity that roots provide to the ground in riparian areas where it keeps erosion from happening when there's a lot of water, mycelium only helps with that, right? It's like, think of it as adding almost like a mesh around these roots, and it'll help contain soil even more. So that's another thing that happens underground that's really useful. Here's another example of mushroom anatomy. Top right here, you have a bunch of different mushrooms that I just picked at my mom's place in Katati, just to show you kind of the diversity of random mushrooms, just going out and picking them. Here's an amanita in about this stage, in the secondary egg stage, where the mushroom cap has popped out, but you can still see the rest of the egg down here. Now, this is particular to amanitas and other mushrooms that grow out of a shell or an egg. Not all mushrooms have these features, but you can still see in the final product a very recognizable mushroom, right? You can see the remnant of the scales at the top, the cap, gills, a little bit of remnant of the partial veil. This used to cover these gills, so it protects the gills until the mushroom is mature. And if you dig these up, like if you dig amanitas up, often you will find this broken egg underground. I'll show you some other examples of that later. Okay, now here's a quick quiz for you guys. So I want to see where your instincts take you, and you don't have to be right, but type in order. So edible, toxic, medicinal. Which mushroom do you think is which? So for example, if you thought that they were edible, toxic, and medicinal from left to right, you would just say A, B, C, etc. I'll give this a couple of seconds if you guys want to participate. There's really there are wrong answers, but you can answer however you like. The point is to kind of show you how easy it is to get confused with mushrooms. And I'll just take a couple when you have them, Milo.
Okay, we've got one guess of BAC.
Okay, well, that is actually the correct answer, so let's go with that. Good job. So yeah, kind of what I highlighted here purposefully is to show you A, which is pretty innocuous looking. That's actually Amanita ocreata, one of the two really toxic mushrooms that you'll find in California. This one is native here as opposed to the death cap, which was imported from Asia at some point. And of course, you have the bright blue or purple bluet, which is edible. One of the few examples of blue or purple mushrooms. That's not a color that you see very often. And then you have turkey tails, which are very common here. Some people do boil them and eat them. I can't imagine that they're very tasty. I've never had them myself, but they are commonly used as a medicinal mushroom. So again, it just goes to show that while in other places in nature, color and brightness can be an indicator to poison or venom, right? You have poison dart frogs, for example, or certain salamanders. Snakes are tricky, right? Because some of them are bright when they're toxic and some of them are not. But in mushrooms, there's just about zero correlation between the brightness and color or how funky they look and whether they're toxic or not. Again, it's really common to have really plain brown, reddish, or white mushrooms that can be super fatal and toxic, and much brighter, more interesting looking things that are actually perfectly fine to eat. So the point is, you never can know this about a mushroom going in. You really have to do your research. Here I show you some examples of what you can see in California. You can find all of these depending on where you're at in the time of year. So I'll start here in the top left. You have black trumpet mushrooms, and these are a type of chanterelle, edible and very delicious, kind of a pain to clean, but and they're hard to see. They often just look like holes in the ground if they're not sticking up too far, especially on brown substrate. You have a gemmed puffball here, or a common puffball here. You can see all the little dots, those little gems. That's edible as well. Here you have a cocora. This is an example of an amanita that is edible. Again, I personally avoid amanitas. I'll explain why later, but you know, they're just too similar looking to really dangerous mushrooms. Here and at the bottom, you have boletes. These are a mix of king and queen boletes, I think. So these are the famous porcino or porcini in the plural. Here's cauliflower mushroom, a little old. That's why it's getting kind of dirty, but this is a great one. It also, if you cut it, it'll grow back every year. Same with oyster mushrooms, which you can see here on this tree. Candy caps right here in the middle. These are a fun one, especially for beginners. Candy caps kind of smell strongly of maple syrup. In fact, people often make ice cream and cookies out of them, so really pleasant. This is a California chanterelle, which is a type of golden chanterelle, choice, edible, really sought after, probably my favorite mushroom to eat. And here's another bluet in the bottom right. Here are some examples of toxic mushrooms that you can find, some of them in California. Again, we've got the Amanita, this is the fly agaric, or Amanita muscaria. Comes in red. It also can tinge orange or yellow. I believe there's even an almost pure white varietal, but these are toxic. They won't kill you, but you won't have a good time. They're definitely going to upset your stomach, cause a lot of vomiting and stuff like that. Here are the two important ones in the middle. If you don't remember anything else out of this class other than don't eat random mushrooms, it's definitely stay away from these two. This is Amanita phalloides, the death cap mushroom, recognizable by the fact that it's got all the morphological structure of an amanita. You can see the egg there. And it's kind of got an olive tinge to it. That's one of the trademark tells of a death cap. And then again, you have Amanita ocreata here, the destroying angel, which is mostly white, but very deadly. I can't name all these other ones. I know there's a gallerina in there, less common and not as mistakable for other things. So yeah, again, this isn't meant to be exhaustive or all inclusive, but just some examples. Of course, some mushrooms are psychedelic. Interestingly, the Amanita muscaria is both. It's both toxic and psychedelic. One misconception about psychedelic mushrooms is that what's happening is that you're being poisoned. And so when people, you know, have reactions to them, what's happening is it's your body fighting off the poison, but that's actually not true. The psilocybin and psilocin, I think there's a couple of different substances here that are at least in, sorry, not in that mushroom, but in what you see at the bottom. And what you see in the middle, that's psilocybe cyanensis, the wavy cap there in the middle. And I think that's the golden teacher there in the bottom left. So yeah, they do affect the functionings of your brain and can cause hallucinations, et cetera, but it's definitely not you being poisoned. So again, these are things that you need to know what they are, so you know what to stay away from and what's potentially dangerous. So here's kind of a summary on principles on foraging identification. I tried to keep this mostly visual and low on text, but these are important, so I wanted to make sure that I had a backup to what I was saying. So yeah, so like I said, find someone who has experience foraging and that you know well and trust and that can kind of teach you about mushrooms if you want to go out and start learning about them. Understand the area where you are foraging. You kind of want to know what grows there mostly. Are you around, you know, oak, tan oak, eucalyptus, again, because of that symbiotic relationship, different mushrooms grow around different trees. You'll see redwood forest has totally different mushrooms than an oak forest, for example. So you want to really understand what's going on and what you're looking for. Learn the toxic cousins. I'll have a slide that covers that in just a second. It's hard to identify mushrooms in the field just randomly, but if you are looking for the chanterelle, for example, it's really easy to learn the other two mushrooms that kind of look like a chanterelle, but that might be toxic or even fatal, and you learn the specific differences between those two mushrooms. It's almost like a, can you tell the difference between these two pictures kind of exercise? It's kind of like that. When you see them side by side, it's actually pretty easy to tell the differences. Ask questions. There are tons of groups online that can help you ID mushrooms. There are tons of people like me and of much, much higher experience. Some are mycologists. You can get memberships with mycological societies and go out on official foraging trips. There are about 1 million different ways that you can learn more about mushrooms, do it safely, and educate yourself to the point where eventually you can have, a nice plate full of mushrooms in the winter and make dishes and be proud of something that you went out and foraged yourself, which is really exciting. Anyone who's ever gone hunting or fishing, it's a similar concept. You just don't need a gun or a fishing rod. Check your references, right? Again, there's books and sites, and it's always good to kind of cross-reference things. Even when I've gone out, this was a forage that Milo and I did here. We've got a bunch of chanterelles, black trumpets, and hedgehogs, and that was only half or a third of the haul. So that was a really lucky day where we picked a lot of mushrooms. We still kind of double check those mushrooms very carefully, check our books, even though we're experienced and we've eaten them plenty of times. We want to make sure that you're not sneaking in something dangerous. Don't eat anything you're unfamiliar with. Again, until you have a lot of experience, you really shouldn't be eating any of the mushrooms that you pick. ID using multiple features. Usually if you can get 4 or 5 macro or micro features, and some of them are secondary, they're not related to the mushroom directly. So for example, was it growing out of a tree or out of the ground? That's a big subdivision into what it could possibly be. You're not gonna find an oyster mushroom growing out of the ground. Usually they're growing off of wood. And then, color is iffy because as mushrooms get older, colors can fade. And while under a microscope, spores of a specific species will always be a certain color, the mushroom itself will not always be strongly in that color. So color can be a good thing as a group of identifiers, but it's never a good identifier by itself. Pick whatever you like as long as you don't eat it. So if you want, I do this all the time. If you want to pick a few mushrooms that you find that are different, take them home, cut them in half, take pictures of them, go through a mushroom book or go online and see if you can identify it. It's really fun. It's like an investigation. And again, you can put them on Facebook and mushroom groups, and there's lots of people that will come out and say, oh, it looks like this or it looks like that. And while I wouldn't trust any single person's identification online, it can point you in the right direction. And then you can go, oh, okay, this is an Amanita. Now I can go to an Amanita book specifically, or just a general mushroom book. I'll give you some references at the end. Speaking of Amanitas, I avoid eating Amanitas. Probably something Milo taught me, but in general, everyone has a different level of risk. I know that if I avoid Amanitas, I'm basically not going to eat 2 of the really deadly mushrooms in California that I'm most likely to encounter. So it's an easy way for me to be really safe because I know that if I screw up in another species, most likely I'm going to have a stomach ache from it, but I'm not going to need a liver transplant. So again, it's just a matter of risk. Take pictures by all means, whether you want to take pictures of the mushroom in situ or whether you want to pull it up. If you are taking pictures for identification, it's important that you take some pictures up close and you want to get the whole structure in the cap, as well as it's important that you get under it and look at the gills. So if you're not going to pull it out, use a flash, get a picture of the gills, or if you are going to pull it out, then again, later at home, you can cut it in half. That's always really helpful for identification. Here's an example of lookalike. So you see a California chanterelle on the left of your screen. And then an example that I found of Western jack-o'-lanterns, which are really cool mushrooms, but they are toxic and will make you sick. Mine were older, so a little bit darker orange. You can see on the far right an example I found on the internet of something that looks a lot more similar, at least in color, to the chanterelle. These also supposedly glow green in the dark, but you can only see it on very young specimen that are full of spores. And usually you need a long exposure camera to expose it because it happens kind of slowly. But that's kind of a cool fact about jack-o'-lanterns. Again, chanterelle grows out of the ground. Jack-o'-lanterns grow out of wood. So that's another good thing. Here's why I don't pick amanitas. The amanita on the right, spring amanita, or Kokora, I think it's also called, perfectly edible, supposedly delicious, etc. Mushroom on the left, death cap, like you will almost assuredly need a liver transplant, and a couple of people die from eating these every year. As you can see, first of all, in these pictures, the remnant of the veil that you see here, I don't know if you can see my mouse moving, that could very easily also be on this death cap. This death cap in particular just happens to not be showing veil, and I can actually see the top of the egg here that kind of broke off cleanly or opened cleanly. So it probably doesn't have any remnant. That doesn't mean that it couldn't look like this. So in the end, the only difference between these two mushrooms is the color. And again, if they're out in the field for a while and they age, that color difference may get more and more vague and they might look even more similar. So again, a good example of why I do not eat amanitas, although I will pick them and ID them to get more familiar. Here's a cool one, kind of a very alien looking mushroom. This is in the stinkhorn family, and these were growing right in my front yard a couple of winters ago in wood chips. Often when you bring in wood chips, you're also importing mycelium unknowingly. And so these witch's eggs, as well as they're called, were growing. And I kind of went through a process of washing them and taking the layers off. You can see the one split in half here, shows you what looks like roots, but really that's the mycelial thread that kind of popped up and then grew the mushroom. And you can see the compressed mushroom before it comes out. And then you can see the full grown mushroom here, at which point is no longer edible. They're kind of funky. That's why they're called stinkhorns. These mushrooms have kind of a slimy, wet portion at the top that turns black once they've sprouted completely, and they spread their spores by attracting flies and then having the flies land on them, and then the flies fly off with their little wet feet. So that's why they're smelly. They're trying to attract carrion insects. But again, cooked in some butter and garlic, these are pretty good. A little on the funkier side for people who are not super experienced. But again, it was a really cool process to catch something myself and be 100% sure what I was doing. Here are other examples of mushrooms that I've picked and cooked. This is a chicken of the woods here on the top left. Oyster mushrooms, which I then battered and fried. Those were really good meat replacement too if you're a vegetarian. They're really hearty and full of protein. And here are some boletes. Again, this was a trip I did with Milo, I believe. So yeah, there's a little bit of medicinal use to mushrooms. I'm not an expert and I don't use them medicinally. I think that a lot of Asian communities do. So if you go to a Chinatown and go to like a pharmacy or even their grocery stores, they'll have tons of dried mushrooms and they'll grind them up into powder, make tea out of them. Ask the Chinese community. They know a lot more about medicinal mushrooms than I do. Here's a couple of references. I got to show you this one, Milo. It's an old book from Berkeley from like the 1970s, I think. And my mom just picked it up at a thrift store and it's really, really cool. It's great for kids, especially very simple, hand drawn. I forget. Oh yeah, Ronald Russo. And I looked him up and he was like a member of the Mycological Society for a long time. David Aurora's Field Guide and his main book here, who were really, really famous. This California Mushrooms book is great, full color as well. Here's a couple of web references. Another example I use, this is not my own photo, although I have found these, but that's a bird's nest fungus there in the middle. And you can see just how different it looks from other mushrooms. It literally has these little seed pods in the middle that look like eggs that then shoot out. And I imagine there's spores in there, but just so completely different from anything else. And then here I have a mosaic of a bunch of different mushrooms that I collected up in Northern California, and you can see the variety, everything from what looks like a fried egg here to little tooth gills to corals that don't even look like mushrooms at all, but they are a fungus. So again, the idea is to show you kind of the diversity of color and form in the fungal world. So that's all I have. Let me exit this screen share here.
We have some really excellent questions, and the first one comes from Stefan, and he asks, can spores themselves contain toxins, same way as apple seeds contain cyanide? Is there any health risk in inhaling or consuming spores?
Okay, first of all, I'm no longer screen sharing, am I?
No.
Okay, cool. I want to make sure I wasn't technology impeded. Great question. And I'll do some follow up with you guys as well. I'm not necessarily going to know the answers to all of these, but I'll do some research. I have never heard of spores themselves being toxic or causing any kind of problems. I mean, in the way that any other powder could cause you a problem if you were to aspirate a bunch of spores sniffing a very dry mushroom. And they can, those really crumbly, like dead man's foot that will grow out of concrete and like weird places. They're really ugly looking. And basically, I've never seen them wet at all. They're kind of dry and crumbly. If you were to like take a, nose full of that and sniff it, you would get thousands of spores. I guess there's always a chance. I don't know how many recorded cases there are of this, but if you breathe in, especially thousands of spores into your respiratory system and they land in your wet lungs, there's always a possibility that they could take root there essentially. And I've read of at least one medical case where someone had mycelium growing inside their body, basically either in their lungs or one even spread to the brain. So these are extremely rare cases and like not things that are going to happen to you. But generally, I would say that the toxic substances that like amanitas form, for example, are not contained in the spores themselves. There's something that develops later. But again, I'm not a scientist, so I can't say that for sure. I'll do a little research though and find out and get back to you guys.
So some of this I think you covered, but Aaliyah asks, is there a way to know if a mushroom is poison or not without testing them? And are there any telltale signs, or is testing necessary?
All very good questions. I did cover some of this. Again, there is no rule of thumb, so to speak, with mushrooms. There is no one or two things you can put in your pocket and take with you and be like, oh, if it turns this blue, or if it looks like this, I know it's toxic or I know it's not toxic. That's just not how it works. Now, in terms of positive ID, again, if I go out and pick something I'm really familiar with, and then I take it home, I cut one in half, I cross-reference it online, and I look at a couple of books, and maybe I ask Milo his opinion. And all those different sources tell me that that is a California chanterelle, for example. Is that 100% positive ID? Well, no, if you're really being scientific about it. The only way to 100% positively ID a mushroom is to take a spore print, which you can do by cutting off the stem of the mushroom and then placing it on top of a white piece of paper with like a bowl or a cup over it and leaving it overnight. Because again, mushrooms have millions, if not billions of spores in them, it will continue to deposit spores down. And eventually what will happen is it'll make a spore print. Now that's one, really cool looking because it's almost like mushroom art. But two is you can take some of those spores, put them under a microscope and examine the length and width of each spore. Spores are just going to look like little ovals usually, right? Or circles. I believe they're single cells. And so the shape and color, along with some of the morphological stuff, you can research that, and that will give you 100% positive ID because spores, the color of spores never changes like the mushroom. So just through color alone, but in combination with the size and shape and density, I think, the quantity of spores per, square nanometer or whatever it is. Again, I've never done that. I don't have a microscope at home. So there is 100% for sure way to do it scientifically. But generally, if you follow good practices, you can be very safe and almost 100% certain of what you're getting. Good question.
Daniel asks, do you need to have a permit or written consent to harvest mushrooms in public locations? And is there a limit on how many mushrooms you can collect?
That is a very good question. Limits and permits. Yeah, Milo, feel free to chime in if you know a little bit more than me on this. I am not aware of any government organization that issues permits for mushrooms, probably with the exception of if you were commercial forager or something like that. But usually, so you have to check the rules, right? If there's a park in your city or a regional park, whatever it is, usually their website will tell you whether you can forage mushrooms there or not. If it's ambiguous or it doesn't talk about it, personally as a citizen, I would see that as it's okay for me to take mushrooms there. However, you should still follow some basic guidelines, sort of a leave no trace type of thing. So if you're going to go off trail, be careful. Don't trample other plants. If there's areas that are sensitive where it says, please don't leave the trail, don't leave the trail there. Look for mushrooms along the trail, on wood, etc. I would say a good rule of thumb, even if you run into like a field full of mushrooms, is 4 pounds per person per day is probably a pretty good measure. You don't need to take more mushrooms than that, and it's nice to leave some for other people. But yeah, so I hope that answers your questions. You have to look up the specific area that you're in, a regional park, city park, whatever it is, and find out. Again, if it's ambiguous, I would take that as I can. But I'd be careful about how you do it so that you're not ticking people off. And of course, private property is always a place where if you have permission from the landowner, you can forage mushrooms to your heart's content there.
Carrie asks, what's your favorite mushroom or fungi dash? Which one do you think is the most interesting?
Ooh, wow, that's a tough question. I don't know if I came prepared for that one. You saw some of them in the photos that I put in my slides because I tried to pick the most interesting, most colorful looking ones. I'd have to say for as common as it is depicted in culture, Amanita muscaria, the red mushroom, the red cap with the white dots, is one of the most interesting because it's been around for so long, and there are speculations that that's what may have led to the color of Santa Claus's robe, is because in Scandinavian countries, these mushrooms are a big part of myth. Supposedly, reindeer have been seen in those countries, and this is all like rumor and stuff. I can't substantiate any of this, but reindeer have been seen eating these mushrooms and getting high and sort of like, walking around confused. Some people say that that's where the myth of Santa's flying reindeer came from, is really the reindeer were on a psychedelic trip, and that's why they thought they could fly. So I think the Amanita muscaria, you'll see it in old Disney movies. If you watch Snow White and watch a scene through the woods, you're very likely to see what is an Amanita muscaria, essentially. Usually they're drawn a little fatter, but there'll be this red cap with white dots. And I think that's super fascinating. Along with sort of like the toxins in Amanita phalloides, the death cap, what's interesting, I think, is scientists trying to figure out what the purpose of these toxins are, because a mushroom doesn't really care whether you're getting a psychedelic trip out of it, and a mushroom really doesn't want to kill you. There's no benefit to the species in doing that. And so the question science is left with is, well, then why is this mushroom so toxic, right? So far, one of the answers is they think that it's a byproduct of something else. It's a leftover substance that is produced through the mushroom doing other things that do benefit its survival or its evolution. But I don't think science has answered that question yet. Somebody who gets a doctorate in mycology later and wants to tackle why are death caps so toxic and what does that do that's beneficial for the species, or does it, is a really great question to explore, but it's going to take years of actual science to do that. I think one of the other really interesting things, someone in my last class asked, why do you think mushrooms are so diverse? Because for a kingdom, it's really diverse. Well, one thing, and my girlfriend's a biologist, so I asked her this question because I knew she could answer better than me. And one of the things she told me is, well, for one, they're really old. So like she studies birds, and most of the birds she studies are like 60 to 70 million years old. They estimate that fungus in the kingdom may have started anywhere between 500 million and 1 billion years ago. So that's a long time, even on an evolutionary scale, to be on Earth. They probably diversified in an unoccupied niche space. It was so long ago that really not a lot of animals were around. And so they kind of had the lay of the land. They also reproduce really quickly. And so anything with a high turnover rate that reproduces like that is something that's going to tend to evolve. and diversify faster, as opposed to something that reproduces once a year. So I think that's something really fascinating about mushrooms as well, is they've been around us since a long time before humans existed, and a lot longer than most other animals or plants. Oh, and then I think maybe she asked my favorite. My favorite one to eat is definitely like a golden chanterelle, California chanterelle, one of the tastiest mushrooms you can find.
Okay, we have two more questions about mushrooms, and then we have two questions about your career. Sophia asks, how does climate change and wildfires affect the amount and types of mushrooms?
Another good question for an actual scientist. I was reading a scientific paper this morning looking up sort of the evolution and how long they've been around. And there are studies, I think in Europe, that are being done. So giving some conjecture here and an educated guess, one thing that would affect the fungal species is the plants that they're symbiotic with. So if fires and climate change is really affecting the population of vegetation in the area, then one would assume that that is going to eventually affect the mycelium and all the fungus that sort of interacts with those plants, right? As well as, I imagine mycelium has to fruit eventually. I mean, it can spread as this underground spider web, but to actually reproduce sexually and create a new organism, it does have to sprout and put out spores, et cetera. So fires, yeah, it's a good question. I really don't have enough, I haven't studied the data enough to know that, because I imagine just like plants, there's a damaging period to the fire, but there's also a regrowth period where everything is fertilized much more. And so I imagine that, I think even, don't morels come up after fires, Milo? Yeah, so there are mushrooms that might even benefit from forest burning down. But I would say that overall, climate change and large changes in wildfires and increases probably can't be good for fungus overall. Just a guess, but yeah, good question for an actual scientist.
And Aaliyah asks, you said you go look for mushrooms during the winter/spring. Is that the best time to find a large amount of mushrooms? What are the best conditions for mushrooms to grow in?
Yes, so I'll speak mostly for North America and California, since that's what I'm used to. You go to Southeast Asia, it's a little bit different. Europe can be similar to here, but so, and this is mostly my gut and not something I've read a lot about, especially because there are certain guidelines, but even experienced foragers aren't always going to be able to tell you like, oh, we're definitely finding mushrooms today. So what I've noticed in my experience is that usually if it's the first rain and it's been really dry, usually takes a little bit longer. But once you're in the rainy season, a few days after the rain, in the forest at least, is a great time to find mushrooms, right? The ground needs time to soak. I think the mycelium needs time to realize that the moisture conditions are right. Because if mushrooms pop up when it's too dry, they just dry out too fast, and I don't think they get as much spore spreading time. So yes, kind of early fall to late spring, depending on where you are, is the best time to find your traditional, forest mushrooms, porcini and chanterelles, et cetera. There are also porcini that grow in the sand on the beach. Altitude seems to be something that affects mushrooms as well. Again, Milo and I have done a lot of mountaineering, and it seems like generally speaking, once you're past like 6,000 or 7,000 feet, you just get fewer and fewer mushrooms. And then certainly once the plants are gone, I don't usually see a lot of fungal activity. But even before that, there are times where the altitude is just too much. I don't know specifically how that affects fungus, but I just know from experience that I won't see them there. So usually between sea level and 6,000 feet is kind of the best place. The forest has the richest diversity probably of mushrooms. Again, this doesn't mean you can't find mushrooms in the summertime. It depends on the mushroom, and also depends on the forest. There are forests up in Northern California that are sort of like rainforests because the wet fog comes in from the ocean and the canopy traps it in. And so there are almost always a good level of moisture in those forests. Those are forests where you're likely to find mushrooms year round, even though you might still get more in the fall and winter.
Carrie asks, would you recommend other people follow the same path that you did through the Marine Corps? Or do do you think that there are better ways to get your experience and knowledge?
Um, that's a big question. I think that just like anything else in life, like, I'm on plan G or something. My life has worked out really well. I have a great career that I really enjoy. I'm able to afford life in the Bay Area. I live in Oakland. That's something that I think a lot of people struggle with, even who have degrees or master's degrees. So I don't have student debt from that, but I also don't have all those degrees if I needed to switch fields. So my point being that luck, I think, is a big factor in a lot of these things. Again, I didn't even pick air traffic control. I just kind of got thrown into it. Now, that being said, once I got into it, I worked hard and kept up with my academics. And once I had a focus, then I put my focus into doing well in that field. But I think that most people who have been in their field for a while will tell you that how they got into it isn't always like what they dreamed or what they specifically knew they were going to do when they were 15. Sometimes it is, but lots of things can happen in life to kind of throw you off your path or to open a different door. So I think it's important to sort of find out what you don't want to do as much as you want to find out what you do want to do, because you'll notice that if you're in something that you're really interested in and that really excites you, the work kind of comes easy, right? If you find yourself struggling and just hating everything you're doing in math or in English or in a particular subject, sometimes it just means you're not putting the right effort in, or you haven't met the right teacher that can really inspire you. But sometimes it means it's not an area that you're inspired by. So maybe try and I would say, what I would suggest is try and think about what inspires you and what general field could you see yourself being excited by. And then sort of narrow your choices down to trying different things in that field. The military is also a really mixed bag. I could have ended up in the infantry or something else. I could have come home with no legs, to be perfectly honest. So there's a lot of PTSD. There's a lot of depression. If I just look at the unit I was in, which was an air traffic control unit, where pretty much everyone, if they didn't get in too much trouble, would have had the same opportunities that I did to go into the FAA and have a great career, et cetera. I mean, one of them died in a car accident. Some of them have PTSD. Some of them are in my position and are in the FAA and are doing great. But it's really mixed, and you're giving up a lot of control over your life when you do something like that. So it can be really great, and it can be a really great alternative to college if you're not ready to go to school, or if you're afraid of putting yourself in hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt for something that you're not sure you want to do. I think that's another common issue, that people in their mid-20s come out of school and they're a couple $100,000 in debt, and they're like, I either can't find work in this field, or I realize I'm not even interested in it. So definitely don't be afraid to look into alternatives to going straight into 4U university if you don't think that that is for you. I'm not discouraging anyone from going to college, by all means. If you're already on a track and that's what you want to do, that's great. Assuming you can manage the debt, college is not something that's going to hurt you in life. It's only going to help you. But again, you only get one life. You kind of have to figure out, am I inspired by this? Do you want to help other people? Do you want to get into something technical? You really got to think about stuff like that. And just like I've heard lawyers say about law school, like, do not go into law school unless you're 100% sure you want to be a lawyer, because of the debt and the amount of stress and work that goes into that. Don't go into the military unless you're willing to be deployed overseas, sometimes for a president who you may or may not agree with, because you're signing a contract for 4 or 5 years and you're making a commitment. Sometimes people are really young when they do that, 17 and a half if your parents sign off, you can do that. So there's some upsides and downsides. At the same time, as a 18-and-a-half-year-old, maybe, I was doing precision approaches, like talking a pilot through a pile of clouds to within 30 feet of centerline on a runway, where basically both those pilots' lives were entirely in my hands. That's not something most 19-year-olds get to do unless you're in the 1% of the population that's in the military. So I also think service in general is a good thing. If you want to take a year off after high school before college and either travel or go work with a volunteer fire department, or talk to people that are in an ROTC unit, or just spend time interviewing people that are in these fields, I think it can be really, really helpful to sort of explore what you think inspires you and what kind of career field you can go into. I think that often we're getting pushed into this, like, well, this is what I'm doing next, and this is what I'm supposed to do next. And it's like, we just don't take, society doesn't really give us a chance to like take a second and breathe and think, is this really actually what you want to do? Are you fulfilling someone else's fantasy or your parents' wishes, et cetera? So I'm probably going beyond the scope of the question, but that's generally what I would say. And do your research. Talk to people who have done it. If anybody, my contact info is at the end of the class, and Milo can leave it with you as well. If you end up later on when you're 18 or whatever, you're thinking about joining the military or the Marine Corps specifically, and you want to ask more questions, please like text me, call me, email me. I'm more than happy to give you more detail and share more information.
Great. And we just have one quick question. We've just got a couple minutes left. And Stefan just was wondering, what was the training like in the military?
Well, the Marine Corps is a very specific, tiny fraternity that's very tied to its traditions. So like for example, the boot camp scene in Full Metal Jacket, while that's from the 70s and a little bit dated, it's really not far off the mark. So certainly like you go into boot camp and like that most intense boot camp that also has a lot of comedy in it, because drill instructors, they don't get any training in this, but man, are they hilarious. The way they make fun of people and the way they break people down is just outrageous. And certainly mine were like that as well. And everyone else I heard stories from are just hilarious. Not always PC, but really, really funny. And the idea of the Marine Corps is that, you know, that's what they do, is they make Marines. And so the idea is to break you down so that you get rid of kind of all your preconceptions and then build you back up. And the Marine Corps is an infantry-centric organization. So even when you're not in the infantry, all the support units are kind of supporting the infantry. So at the beginning in boot camp, you're with everyone. Infantry, cooks, air traffic controllers, everybody goes to the same exact boot camp. There's only 2 of them in the US, split by the Mississippi, West Coast and East Coast. And then once you go into combat training for non-infantry MOSs, MOS is a military occupational specialist, your specialty, it's your job. I went to a 3-week infantry school designed for non-infantry Marines. Infantry Marines go to a 3-month, it's called School of Infantry, because that's their main school. That's their A school where they learn their job, whether they're a gunner, machine gunner, you know, grenadier, whatever. And then after that, I went to A school and did my specific technical aviation training. And then after that, I got out and did on-the-job training in the field. That's the weird thing about aviation, is you can be an experienced pilot or a traffic controller, but you move to a new airport or a new platform, you have to relearn a bunch of stuff because it works differently. So the training was mostly great and a really fun experience. Another thing that's important to identify in yourself before you decide whether the military is right for you is, do you have an inherent problem with authority? Meaning, can you handle someone screaming at your face for something that you don't even think was your fault that you did? If your answer when you watch something like that is like, oh, hell no, I would never put up with that, probably the military is not for you, especially not the Marine Corps. So you got to put up with a lot of that. But again, the roads to success are many, I think. And so it can be a great opportunity for the right people at the right time.
All right. Thank you so much, Dan, for such a fascinating presentation. And now we are going to do a class discussion.